The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back as far as the feeling of infantile helplessness. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. The series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics, which are classics for a reason. From each, I've selected an excerpt, 20, 30, 40 minutes, no more than an hour ever. And the idea is to have an introduction to an important work. We'll do a close reading accompanied by the text. In this episode, we are turning to Sigmund Freud and his 1930 work, Civilization and its Discontents. Freud stepping onto the world stage even more broadly than being a psychologist and psychotherapist, and commenting on history, politics, philosophy, morality, but in this excerpt, especially religion and its psychological function. Let's go to the text. Freud opens Civilization and its Discontents by reflecting on some exceptional people who achieve actually good things in life and who are widely esteemed for them. In the second paragraph, though, he turns to one of those exceptional few, a friend who has a critique of Freud's views on religion, as Freud had written from an earlier book. So let's read a little. My friend, in his letters to me, I had sent him my small book that treats religion as an illusion. And he answered that he entirely agreed with my judgment upon religion, but that he was sorry I had not properly appreciated the true source of religious sentiments. This, he says, consists in a peculiar feeling, which he himself is never without, which he finds confirmed by many others, and which he may suppose is present in millions of people. It is a feeling which he would like to call a sensation of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. Now, carrying on, this feeling, he adds, is a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. It brings with us no assurance of personal immortality, but it is the source of the religious energy which is seized upon by the various churches and religious systems, directed by them into particular channels and doubtless also exhausted by them. One may, he thinks, rightly call oneself religious on the ground of this oceanic feeling alone, even if one rejects every belief and every illusion. Okay, so this is an interesting claim that religion is not a matter of faith, it is a matter of feeling. So it's not a matter of willing oneself or being conditioned by social environments into believing certain things. It is a feeling that is real inside the subject. One attends to it, and that is the proper origin of religion. It is also interesting that this is not a metaphysical claim about religion, that religion is based on some sort of external metaphysical or objective or intrinsic fact about reality. Instead, it is an inside the human being, something that is true or factual about the subject, a certain feeling. And then the claim is that that original feeling is what then is perhaps tied to metaphysical doctrines or epistemological doctrines or moral doctrines, and it might be systematized and institutionalized and so on. And the claim further is that this is a unique feeling that we're going to call the religious feeling, but it's not necessarily a peculiar to me as an individual, because this person believes it's actually Romain Rolland, a novelist with whom Freud was friendly in the 1920s, claiming that millions of people are having the same feeling. Now, Freud is an atheist. Freud does not believe there's any sort of metaphysical reality to which religious belief corresponds. He's much more a man of science, and so he's going to reject factual claims. Nonetheless, faithful claims. Nonetheless, he's not going to deny the factual claim here that Romain Rolland and others do have a certain kind of feeling. So what do we say about this? Now, Freud, in the next paragraph, then says, well, why don't I try this for myself? And so he introspects and consults his feelings, and he finds a negative result. He says, I cannot discover this oceanic feeling in myself. It's not easy to deal scientifically with feelings, one of the great issues methodologically in psychology. So one can attempt to describe their physiological signs. So when you are angry, perhaps your skin flushes and you start to perspire, or you get afraid, so you're feeling fear, and so your heart starts to beat faster. So one can perhaps get to these feelings a little bit indirectly by attending to the physiology. But since Freud himself doesn't have the feeling, he can't just read it off on himself. Instead, what he's going to do, as he says, is say, what is the ideational content, or how can we put into words what this feeling is about and what it's trying to describe? So I'm going to fall back on, as he says, the ideational content, which is most readily associated with the feeling. And then he starts to put some words to it. So we have this metaphor of an ocean, and we all hopefully we all have that experience at some point of standing in front of the ocean and sensing just how huge the ocean is. This sense of, to switch to not a spatial metaphor, but the temporal metaphor that Roland had mentioned. Eternity, timelessness, so some sense of just vastness along these various dimensions. And then Freud tries himself here. So maybe that is to say, it is a feeling of an indissoluble bond of being one with the external world as a whole. And certainly people who have this sort of feeling will often use that kind of language. I feel at one with the universe, or there's no distinction between me and the universe, or I'm at one or with the ocean. The sense of boundaries dissolving and becoming unified with something grand, huge, and great. Now, Freud then gets to be critical next, saying if this is what we are talking about, then he goes on to say, from my own experience, I could not convince myself of the primary nature of such a feeling. But this gives me no right to deny that it does not, in fact, occur in other people. So he's not denying that other people have this feeling. The question is going to be whether they are interpreting the feeling correctly. Is it really a primary, or in some sense foundational? The only question is whether it is being correctly interpreted and whether it ought to be regarded as the fons et origo of the whole need for religion. And then translating from the Latin, fountain or foundation, and origin. So is this feeling really the foundation of religion, and is it the origin of religion? Now, Freud is going to argue that it is not. The feeling is real, but it's not being given a correct interpretation here. And so he's going to bring to bear various psychoanalytical tools that he has developed over the course of years and developed into more broadly his psychological theory that is called psychoanalysis. So what I'm going to do then is attempt to discover a psychoanalytic, so to analyze the psyche by means of these tools, that is a genetic explanation of such a feeling. And the interesting here is the reference to genes. So there's an origin, and then there's a development and a manifestation in various ways over time. And so we're going to look at this feeling through that interpretive framework. So this is a feeling of oneness with the universe, kind of a unification with the ownership, or kind of me, a comprehending feeling, in some sense, a unification or joining with the universe as a whole. So what is this me? And so Freud introduces here his word, the ego, the I. And he says, normally, there's nothing of which we are more certain than the feeling of our self, of our own ego, me, I, myself. I'm aware of it, and I am certain of it. Further, this ego appears to us as something autonomous and unitary. I have my act together. I'm the same me as I was an hour ago. And I have some measure of autonomy, that is to say, distinctness and perhaps control. I make the laws or the rules for myself, what's going on in my mind, and so on. Now he then says, while this often feels certain, sometimes this appearance is deceptive. That such an appearance is deceptive, and that on the contrary, the ego is continued inwards without any sharp delimitation into an unconscious mental entity, which we designate as the id, and for which it serves as a kind of facade. This was a discovery first made by psychoanalytic research, which should still have much more to tell us about the relation of the ego to the id. So there is my sense of myself as autonomous, as distinct and unitary and so on, but he's pointing out that there is much more to our psychological life, and that even our conscious self merges into various unconscious or subconscious sorts of things, so to speak, that there's a great deal that's going on beneath the conscious surface of our minds. And in Freud's theory, in fact, the majority of our psychological life takes place below the surface. We're not in control of it. And all of that unconscious psychologic energy or psychic apparatus he labels the id. What we call the ego is a kind of a surface or consciously manifested part of one's psyche as a whole. And at various other places he argues that the ego is in fact not only superficial but much weaker, that the more powerful psychological forces where most of the work is done are done unconsciously in the id. But toward the outside, now if we then say, well, what about my ego in relation to the outside, not my ego in relation to what's further inside? Toward the outside, at any rate, the ego seems to maintain clear and sharp lines of demarcation. So there's me, and then there are all of the objects of outside that I am aware of, and I can make a pretty clear distinction between the I and the rest of the world. It does go on, interestingly, to suggest another psychological state, or use it as an example, where this distinction between the ego as being sharp and distinct and autonomous and being merged with something other than itself is a real phenomenon. And it's not necessarily something inside, but it is something outside. And he talks about the experience of love. At the height of being in love, the boundary between ego and object threatens to melt away. Against all the evidence of the senses, a man who is in love declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. All right, so another interesting case where the ego seems to be dissolved and a unity achieved with something outside itself. So what the ego is, there's lots of interesting examples here, and when we then turn to this oceanic metaphor that Romain Rolland is suggesting and is going to base religion upon, maybe the territory is more complicated here. We need to have a good theory of the self before we can pronounce on that. All right, also he goes on, and this is also part of psychoanalytic theory, to emphasize this genetic interpretation or genealogical or developmental understanding of the ego. The ego is not the same at birth as it is when one was 5, as when one was 10, as it is when one is an adult. Further reflection, this beginning paragraph here tells us that the adult's ego feeling cannot have been the same from the beginning. It must have gone through a process of development. And now, interestingly, we go right back to infancy. Does the infant have a sense of a unified, distinct self, an autonomy? And Freud says, no, clearly not. An infant at the breast does not yet distinguish his ego from the external world. And that's an interesting question then. What is the nature of the infant's experience, right, of the world? Is it just an undifferentiated set of experiences washing in and over him or her, even though he doesn't have a him or her concept yet to put the words to it? Instead, the distinction of the ego from the external world, and some parts of the ego internally from other parts of the ego, even one's conscious self from one's body, all of that develops, all of that is learned. He goes on to talk about muscular things. Something happens to my body, and I learn that there's my hand, and something is happening to my hand, and then also I at some point have a sense of control, that I'm making some sort of decision and then my fingers move. So all of that gets parsed out. Or I push my body out and then I start to confront obstacles, or things come that I'm not at all part of my ego and make me become aware of them because they hit me and so on. So there's a long process. So what he then goes on to conclude is, by the time we are adults and our feeling of ourselves as an ego, at present, or rather our present ego feeling, is therefore only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed all-embracing feeling which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. So what we then have is a suggestion that at the beginning there is, so to speak, no ego yet, or that the ego just is everything, is merged with everything, and there's just this all undifferentiated experience that is going on. But by the time we get to an adult, of all of those experiences that are going on, only a small subset of those do we call the I, or the ego. Now, what he then goes on to say is that not all individuals develop their ego feeling to the same extent, or apply it always to the same objects. And so he goes on, and this is the green portion here. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or lesser degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe, the same ideas with which my friend just elucidated the oceanic feeling. Okay, so this is an interesting then psychological claim. Some people develop their ego to be very distinct and well demarcated, and don't retain much of that infantile or infant stage of sense of being one with the universe and just all of these experiences. Other people do not develop their ego as much distinctively and individually, and therefore retain in their psyche a significant amount of that infantile way of experiencing the world. Okay, so what does this have then to do with religion? Because Romain Rolland had wanted to suggest that that is the source of the religious feeling, that oceanic feeling, but Freud now has a different understanding of where this infantile or this oceanic feeling is coming from. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with religion. So he raises this then as the question. Let me scroll down to put this further up on the screen. Have we a right to assume the survival of something that was originally there alongside of what was later derived from it? Undoubtedly. And he goes on to then give some evolutionary metaphors by which we might try to elucidate psychological development. So the first evolutionary metaphor he gives is a biological one. He notes that if we go back in evolutionary history and we consult, say, the fossil records and so on, we find that all of the existing species have evolved out of earlier species. And so there were the great dinosaurs, the great saurians, right? They have all become extinct, but nonetheless, they have evolved and developed into various sorts of creatures that are still with us. So, for example, the crocodile. And so the crocodile's mode of existing is in some sense based on and still retains some of the original dinosaur ways of existing. So maybe what we can then say is, by analogy, our adult conscious life and our sense of our ego and our psychological life more broadly retains some of that infantile way of experiencing the world, as well as some other things that have developed out of that. He then makes in the next paragraph here a point about memory, and to say that it might not just be that our psyche, its capacities and functionings are evolving over time, but it might also be that we have this memory function, and that the memory function is existing from early days, even right from our infancy. And some of those experiences are not forgotten, but rather retained. And so in vestigial form, they can pop up in our adult life. And so maybe we have another kind of evolution that is going on here. Another analogy then he gives is to cities, and if we imagine the archaeology rather of an ancient city. Yes, we have the modern city, but the modern city was in part based on the way the city was 200 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. So he gives us the example of the eternal city, and so it's been around for a couple of millennia, 2.5 millennia or so at this point. And as we do our archaeology, the further we go down, we can still find remnants of old Rome, and then older Rome, and then ancient Rome, all the way down. Now, it might be that some of the foundations have been altered and torn down and rebuilt in various ways, but it's also the case that some of the original things are still there. So Rome has evolved over time, and even in contemporary times, we can still see some of the ancient Rome. So maybe our psychological life, by metaphor, develops like that. Now, how far can we push this metaphor? Well, perhaps he goes on to say here, perhaps we are going too far in this. Maybe we should just say that what's in the past in our mental life can be preserved. It's not necessarily destroyed. So just whatever's going on in infancy is still part of our psyche. But we do want to say, and there's a bit of a normative thing here, so he does go to talk about favorable conditions, and in the normal course of things, what normally happens is we develop to an adult kind of ego with a sense of autonomy, control, strong demarcations between my psychic life and my bodily life, and what's inside and what's outside. And if we are good at introspection, we're even able to delve down into our unconscious to some extent and figure out what's going on there. But at the same time, suppose there is some subnormal or abnormal development where people do not do that very well. Instead, they retain a significant amount of infant-level psychological life and activity. And Freud wants to argue that it's quite possible that lots and lots of people do not do that psychological work, or their normal psychological development doesn't follow that course. Thus, there's a bit of an insult to saying that in many cases people are not yet psychologically developed. Perhaps they've been passive, or they've not been allowed to develop. And so what we have then is a slightly more infantile stage of development. And perhaps in other areas of life, the person has developed a more adult level ego, but not as much as other people. So thus, in the green now, we are perfectly willing to acknowledge that the oceanic feeling exists in many people, and we are inclined to trace it back to an early phase of ego feeling. The further question then arises, what claim this feeling has to be regarded as the source of religious needs. And here he's not very convinced. Feeling religious is not just, oh, the world is very big, oceans are huge, mountain vistas are great, look at all of the stars, and so on. In order to turn that into all of the religion, Freud would want to say you need to add a whole lot more. And so what he wants to do is suggest a different way in which this more infantile state of development and experience is going to be tied to religion. And here he brings in the metaphor of the father and the mother more broadly, but he definitely is emphasizing the father here. There has to be some need that a religious interpretation of this feeling, or a religious building upon this feeling, is going to satisfy. And so here's his main hypothesis. The derivation of religious needs from the infant's helplessness and the longing for the father aroused by it seems to me incontrovertible. So if we then put ourselves back to childhood days, it's quite natural and normal that we feel helpless, we feel weak. We have all of these experiences going on. We cannot provide for ourselves. And so what is necessary for us, and the need that is being satisfied, is the role of the father. The father provides for you. The father protects you. The The Father gives you guidance. And while we are weak and helpless and still developing, and all of the world is surrounding us and washing over us, and we don't feel that we have much of an eye to be able to achieve our values, the role of the Father in that position is essential. Now, it is interesting why Freud is emphasizing the father more than the mother at this point, worthy of another discussion as well. But nonetheless, that then provides a fairly clear connection to religions. When religions start talking about God as the Father, that God will protect me, God will provide for me, God will give me guidance and protection. And perhaps God will sometimes be a stern God and perhaps a punishing God when I get out of line, and so on. So all of those elements of religion, Freud wants to say, all of those are based on a real developmental human psychological state, the state of being an infant developing into a child, into an adult. But then, of course, what we do know is that the normal development of infants into children, into youths, into young adults, into adults, is to develop in one's capacity to think for oneself, do things for oneself, protect oneself, provide for oneself, and so on. And so as one develops into adulthood, one needs one's father less and less, and one eventually becomes a full, competent, independent adult. But what if one doesn't do that very well? One never learns to become psychologically independent, economically independent, to protect oneself. One still feels in all of those ways still as a child. Well, then still one is going to feel the need for a father. But of course, what happens socially is your father starts to distance himself from you, starts to push you out the door as you get into your teen years and on into your 20 years, and making it clear that you need to go out and face the world and stand on your own 2 feet. And of course, that is what happens existentially. But for many people, the hypothesis is that does not happen psychologically. They don't develop the psychological resources to be able to live that way existentially, and so they need a father substitute. And this is precisely what religion provides. It might be a matter of wanting to go back to a more childlike state where you can relax and be passive and just let experiences happen, and at the same time knowing that there's a father there providing for you and looking after you. So that's what Freud is arguing is really going on in religion. The origin of the religious attitude can be traced back in clear outlines as far as that feeling of infantile helplessness. And the oceanic feeling, he thinks that gets tacked on a little bit later. Okay, let's move on to chapter 2. So what's interesting then is Freud has offered a psychological interpretation of religion. He doesn't think that religion is true, but nonetheless it is the case that lots and lots of people are religious, even lots of people who are intellectually not satisfied by the arguments for religion. So the claim here is that whether religion is true or false is not quite the interesting issue. The question is what psychological role religion is playing for people, even if it isn't true. And so now we have a somewhat insulting claim about the origin of religion, that in effect people have not grown up to be able to confront the world entirely on their own. And if there is no God, maybe what we should be doing is teaching people there is no God. Stop relying on it on a crutch. Don't delude yourself with childish fantasies, and so grow up. And that is not, that latter part anyways, the road that Freud is going to take. He is an atheist, but nonetheless he is going to be an atheist who advocates for religion serving a role for a significant number of people. And here, who he has in mind are the common people, or the ordinary people. And he starts to signal that in the second line of the second chapter here. With respect to this religious feeling, I'm not particularly interested in that oceanic feeling and so on. What I'm interested in when it comes to religion is what the common man understands with religion. And here we have an interesting list. System of doctrines and promises, which on the one hand explains to him the riddles of this world with enviable completeness. People want to feel that they have an explanation for the way the world works. and on the other, assures him that a careful providence will watch over his life and will compensate him in a future existence for any frustrations he suffers here. All right, so those are the values that religion offers to the common man. The common man cannot imagine this providence otherwise than in the figure of an enormously exalted Father. Now, we understand this need in children, but what explains it in adults? And here Freud exclaims with some disgust. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality, that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise to this view of life. All right, so that's the vast majority of people, and they just don't have what it takes even to see how childish their belief system is. But there is another group of people who are a little bit more smart, perhaps a little bit more educated. Even them, right, it's kind of disgusting. It's still more humiliating to discover how large a number of people living today, modern, scientific, worldly people, who cannot but see that this religion is not tenable, nevertheless try to defend it piece by piece in a series of pitiful rearguard actions. So they're smart enough to see that religion's not true, but they still, because they need it in some way, will throw out some lame arguments to try to justify it. And then a third category of people who are more intellectual, philosophers, theologians, and so on. One would like to mix among the ranks of the believers in order to meet these philosophers who think they can rescue the God of religion by replacing him by a more impersonal, shadowy, and abstract principle. So those who will say, okay, religion still does something for me, but I'm not going to believe in, the big old man in the sky with the beard. That's too childish, but nonetheless, I'm going to believe that there's some sort of being with a capital B or ultimate reality, some sort of abstract principle. So I'm trying to hang on to God in that particular form. But all of that, Freud says, is after the fact. Real religion is the common man's religion. So let's return to the common man and to his religion, the only religion which ought to bear that name. He then gives a quotation from Goethe. I'll try my German a little more here. Wer Wissenschaft und Kunst besitzt, hat auch Religione. Wer jene beide nicht besitzt, der habe Religione. So in English, he who possesses science and art also has religion, but he who possesses neither of these two, let him have religion. Now, what's interesting then is Freud is putting up three great belief systems, or three great psychological accomplishments: religion, science, and art, and going to discuss them in terms of the functional role that each of them plays psychologically. He seems to be suggesting that if you are a scientist, you don't need religion. If you are an artist, you don't need religion. But if you're a person who has neither serious science credentials or science abilities or art abilities, then religion is for you. And I think the argument is going to be that really religion is for the elite. It requires a lot of discipline, a lot of mathematics, a lot of abstractability. Most people have that. So whatever science does for scientifically minded people, it's going to be the same functions that religion serves, but it's going to be for people who have the intellectual capacities to do so. Art also is going to do the same psychological function. Now, of course, art requires a great deal of effort, and it requires a great deal of creativity. But of course, most people are not that creative, and they're not going to put forth the effort. So artists can get the values that religion provides through their art, but for the vast majority of people who are not at all artistic, religion is going to provide. Now, why do we need these things? And it's interesting that Freud announces his explanation in very pessimistic terms. And what he's going to do in this section here, let me highlight it a little bit more, is to say, it's built into the nature of life that life is pain suffering, and ultimately disappointment. And what we then need psychologically to get through it is some sort of a crutch. Now let's use Freud's own words here. Life, as we find it, is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures. So there's a very strong pessimistic streak here. If we were just to look and try to confront reality straight, life straight, it would be too much for us. We would be crushed psychologically under the terribleness that is life. So what we need then is palliative measures. And a palliative measure is often used in a medical context, people who are dying. And it's whatever methodologies, including prescriptions, medicines, and so on, to ease the pain and to make the dying as painless as is possible. So it's a crutch, a psychological crutch that we all need in order to deal with the terribleness of life. But then he goes on to say there's different types of crutches that people turn to in order to get through life. There are perhaps three such measures: powerful deflections, which cause us to make light of our misery; substitutive satisfactions, which diminish it; and intoxicating substances, which make us insensitive to it. But something of the kind is indispensable. That is to say, we can't be entirely objective and honest about the nature of life. We need, in some sense, psychologically, to have a barrier, a buffer, or some other way of not letting reality impinge upon us too much. Otherwise, it would be just too much to bear. Now, what do we mean by a deflection? Well, a deflection is here's reality, or here's the direction you're going. A deflection is something that sends you off in a particular direction, right? So you don't get the whole, maybe you just zero in on the rest and blank out the rest. So he has a reference here to Voltaire's advice toward the end of Candide. Don't worry about the world as a whole. The world is too chaotic, too painful, too nasty. Instead, what you should do is cultivate your own garden. So have your own chunk of the earth. Let the rest of it go. What you can do is make your own particular little chunk of the world nice and beautiful and feel protected there. And so Freud goes on to argue that science is like that. What the scientist does is to say, I'm not going to deal with the world as a whole. I'm going to go into my laboratory. And in my laboratory, everything is nice and neat and organized and labeled, and I can wear a nice white coat, and everything is clean. And so I can shut out the big, ugly, messy world and come up with theories that kind of pigeonhole reality into nice, neat boxes. And that is my way of dealing with reality. It's a kind of deflection. Substitutive satisfactions. Well, art is in this category. Instead of real reality, I make up a substitute reality. And so what the artist does is goes into his or her imagination and then makes the world into whatever they want and lives in that world psychologically. And so that's an alternative reality, and it enables the person to get through the day, get through the week without having to confront reality in all of its brutality, disappointment, and ugliness. Also, then, intoxicating substances, those ones are kind of obvious. I'm in all kinds of pain, all kinds of disappointment. So I drink too much, or I take various sorts of drugs, and what they do to my mind and body is just enable me to block out just the pain and disappointment of life. So I've got these three strategies. Which one is religion? Is it a deflection? Is it a substitute reality? Is it an intoxicating kind of substance? And then Freud wants to go on and argue for the place of religion in this tripartite distinction that we've offered here. He does go on to say, once again, his very pessimistic assessment about the meaning of life. Meaning of life cannot be about the happiness or the pursuit of happiness or any sort of ecstasy or ultimate enlightenment and so on. Instead, he wants to say the whole world basically is against you. We all want, of course, to be happy, but the world just is not set up that way. The program of happiness is at loggerheads with the whole world. There's no possibility at all of its being carried through. That is to say, the happiness. All the regulations of the universe run counter to it. One feels inclined to say that the intention that man should be happy is not included in the plan of creation. He goes on to explain why. Well, our own bodies are doomed to dissolution and decay, and it just gets worse and worse. The whole rest of the world is trying to kill us. The weather, tornadoes, cold, intense heat, all of the animals and diseases and so on. And then, of course, other people. Who pretend to be your friends, pretend to care about you, who disappoint you, lie to you, disappoint you, try to screw you over in business, and so on. So from all sides, inside and out, we are just doomed to more and more disappointment, and it just adds up until we are going to die. And so what we then learn to do pretty quickly in childhood is lower our expectations. It is no wonder if, as he says here, under the pressure of these possibilities of suffering, men are accustomed to moderate their claims to happiness a little bit later. If a man thinks himself happily merely to have escaped unhappiness or to escaped too much suffering. And then, of course, people try all sorts of strategies and possibilities. Now, what he then wants to argue is for the place of religion. And he's going to argue the fact that religion is a kind of substitutive satisfaction. What we do is we make up a world. We make up a moral code. We make up some explanations of the world that make us feel comforted. We make up a fatherly figure who's looking after us, providing for us. We make up this idea that, yes, this life is so disappointing, but I have this soul that's going to go to this special place and is going to experience bliss. And perhaps also those people who did bad stuff to me, bad stuff is going to happen to them, and maybe I'm going to get to watch. And so what we have then is this alternative substitute reality that pushes my psychological buttons in a whole lot of ways, and it enables me to get through life. Now, restriction then restricts this play of choice and adaptation. It says, don't go out there and experiment and try all the different philosophies and different meanings of life. Here is the package. It's all been worked out by people smarter and better than you. Follow these 10 rules, follow these principles and so on. Listen to the people who are in the hierarchical structure. Do what they tell you and you will achieve happiness. So religion restricts this play of choice and adaptation. Be obedient. It imposes equally on everyone its own path to the acquisition of happiness and protection of suffering. Its technique consists in depressing the value of life. So saying this world is not so important. Don't worry about it. It's the afterlife that is the important one. And distorting the picture of the real world in a delusional manner. And so it makes up all sorts of weird, miraculous things about how the world came into existence and how things happen, virgins giving birth, right, or whatever. And so it's a totally distorted understanding of reality. And then it tells you, don't think too much about it, have faith, and who are you to challenge your intellectual betters? And that's this point here about presupposing an intimidation of the intelligence. At this price, by forcibly fixing them in a cyclical infantilism and drawing them into a mass delusion, religion succeeds in sparing many people an individual neurosis. So it's either that we leave people to their own devices, the common people. But what's going to happen is they're not going to be able to do it. They don't have the creativity, they don't have the energy, the perseverance, they don't have the intelligence to be able to do so. Their life is going to be a whole lot worse. So yes, it is a childish picture of the world, but it's a childish picture that is necessary for people who are still at a mostly childlike stage of psychological development, and it gives them a life that would be less bad than it otherwise would be if they did not have religion. So Freud then ends up endorsing religion for the vast majority of people, offering this psychological interpretation of its value, at the same time as an atheist arguing that it's kind of less humanistically optimistic than the accomplishments of art and science, but they're even so arguing that to a large extent, even those aren't necessarily about the true nature of reality and are only accessible to an elite few.